All right, Jerry. Truly sorry that I wasn't even thinking about getting this recorded. I know I asked you for permission to do it, and I'm sorry that we didn't get
Oh,
that. But
my
true,
fault.
yeah. But truly, you are wonderful, and everything that you do, we truly appreciate, and everything from your education of people, you're working one on one with people, or standing in front of a room full of people, telling them what they should be doing, or protesting, yelling, singing. You've written songs, poetry. You've written this batshit crazy recipe book for working on vegan and vegetarian recipes
Now
that
that
help
part
people.
I'm glad you have on tape or recording.
Okay, so I tried to recall what I could out of this, and of course it's not as fresh the second time, but I knew enough of this to do it from the heart and off the top of my head. I didn't want to have a prepared speech because that comes off stilted typically. So when I do one of these things, I try to do it from the heart and from my mind and try to blend the two as best as I can. And I think, Jerry, I think you do that with your life as well. And I appreciate you being part of our lives from the fracking fight till now and on into the future to try to save a habitable climate. And you and Wes have done fantastic work and are still doing great work. And thank you for all the tips that you send out to people by email. And thank you for alerting us, even in a panic, 1 or 2 days before some big thing comes up for, public comment or whatever. That's super important because if we help each other, then we can collectively work together much better than if we're just individuals trying to keep track of everything on our own. That's just too hard to do. So, thank you very much, and we do appreciate what you do, and that's something that
Thank you so
we don't
much,
say enough
Bobby.
of.
You're looking in the mirror again.
Okay, thank you.
You do that in double and triple. Yeah. Thank you so much.
All right, now it's time to the main feature here. Uh, Before we introduce Mark Lowery, there's something else I need to tell you. We've got the attention of NYSERDA. I have been bugging them for months. I actually called the president of NYSERDA, Doreen Harris's office, got through to the staff person, and got the email. So I invited either that's the president of NYSERDA or somebody that they designate to give us a talk, but they have not said yes yet. I'm hoping that they can do this next month at our next general membership meeting. And if they do, we will let you know. But we're hoping that they can tell us about the generation capacity needs for New York State, as well as storage needs and how that might be pursued, and where in general locations geographically, and something about the timelines as well. That's really super important because we, as Mark Lowery is going to mention too, we've got a draft scoping plan comment period here that's open till the end of April. So that's anybody, including all of you in the audience, are welcome to comment, and we encourage you to comment on that. So beyond that, April, we have one of the newest members of our executive committee, Christina Fuller. Thank you for people that voted. She ended up winning and getting in. Besides the other people that were, renewing their executive committee membership, everybody else got reelected, but she's the new member, and she's going to give a talk in April on what's called the campus move
Wow.
out project. So we're looking forward to that too, and they're looking for people to help with that effort, to volunteer to help with that. That what that's about is when campus students at BCC and Binghamton University, they end their semester, they leave stuff behind, furniture, sometimes clothes. Um, this finds a use for that rather than ended up in the landfill. So anyway, that's what's coming up in the future. We've got a few other things in the works that will fill in the rest of the year with membership meetings as well. And now I want to get to introducing Mark. I got to pull up my
Cheat sheet.
yes, cheat sheet. There's no way I can remember everything. Mark Lowery is a 33 veteran of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. He is the Assistant Director of New York's DEC's Office of Climate Change. After serving in the DEC's Divisions of Fish and Wildlife and Public Affairs and Education, he joined the office as part of its original staff in 2007. Since that time, he has led several public outreach efforts, including those in support of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the State Sea Levels Rise Task Force, and State Climate Action Planning. He has overseen development of the Climate Smart Communities program, including Community Risk and Resiliency Act, including development of the CSC grants and CSC certification programs. He has also led the implementation of the Community Risk and Resiliency Act. This work has included developing a regulation to adopt official state sea level rise projections and several guidance documents related to flood risk reduction. He currently leads the state's Interagency Climate Adaptation and Resilience Work Group, and he is a member of the Climate Action Council's Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel and led development of the Council's Adaptation and Resilience recommendations. So he helped write parts of the draft scoping plan that he's going to be talking about. He's got a bachelor's degree in biology from Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and a master's degree in environmental and forest biology from the State University of New York College in Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York. So with that, I want to welcome Mark Lowery. Thank you for your past talk that you gave several years ago to our group, and thank you for coming back again tonight.
So thank you for the invitation to be back, and certainly want to congratulate Ms. Wiley on the prestigious award. I did speak to this group. I was going to look it up. It must have been 5 or 6 years ago, maybe even longer. Baldy invited me to come back and talk, as he said, about the implementation of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, in particular, the draft scoping plan. He also asked me to talk about adaptation and resilience programs, and I will do that to the extent that we have time and you folks have patience, but I think it's because of the immediacy of the comment period on the CLCPA's scoping plan, I would really prefer to focus on that and make sure we cover that so you folks have some background on the plan, the scoping plan, and if you choose to participate in the public comment opportunities, then you have as much information as we can give you. And it is a long plan. It's something like 324 pages of text plus about another 500 pages of appendices. So it is not a quick and easy read, and most of it is very highly technical. So I will, in the time I have today, talk about the process by which we came up with this plan, and the process for participating in the public comment period and so forth, and give an overview of the plan, and certainly will answer any questions that you may have. So just as you folks already know this, but I usually open these talks with some explanation as to why it's so important that we address this. And as you folks probably already well know, a dangerous gap already exists between our international ambition to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the level of reductions that's necessary to actually avoid dangerous warming. We've already baked into our Earth and atmospheric system a significant amount of climate change, and our current policies and targets, as much as all of the nations and states like to pat themselves on the back, we are still going to not only allow warming to exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade, but most likely 2 degrees centigrade as well. And at that level, we can anticipate seeing runaway or development of positive feedback loops, such as methane being released from thawing permafrost that could precipitate even runaway global warming. So for the sake of our children and our grandchildren, and perhaps even our great-grandchildren, we need to take steps right now, not only to prepare for the effects of climate change, but to do what we can to do our part and to take our rightful leadership role as New Yorkers to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what the CLCPA is all about, establishing leadership, taking advantage of the fact that we are a large economy. New York State is the 10th largest economy in the world, and is often seen as a political leader, a social leader, a thought leader, and in fact enacted the CLCPA in July of 2019. In my notes, if you'll see, I just stumbled. I wrote that we enacted this in 1991. It's when we should have enacted it, but we actually enacted it in 2019. It became effective on January 1st of 2020. The CLCPA has a lot of stuff in it, and I will go through just a few of the requirements at a high level. As many of you have probably heard, it sets in the statute mandatory greenhouse gas emissions reductions for the economy. It does not set emission reduction standards for any particular sector, for any particular factory, or specific activity, but for New York State's economy, it says that we have to achieve an 85% reduction of our greenhouse gas emissions based on a 1990 baseline by 2050, and a 40% reduction by 2030. The law requires that the Public Service Commission establish orders, proceedings to ensure large investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency to support what will become an electrified economy. These include establishment of a standard so that 70% of the electricity that is sold in New York, whether it's generated inside New York State or outside the boundaries of the state, 70% of that electricity must come from renewable sources, and by 2040, all of our electricity must come from zero carbon electricity. And again, supporting goals, supporting requirements include requirements for distribution or for establishment, construction of offshore wind power, distributed solar power within the state, and to support, to ensure grid reliability and to account for the intermittency of wind, water, and solar, requirements for energy, grid scale energy storage. There are also very strong commitments to climate justice and transition, and I want to talk about those because these really are things that many people don't tend to focus on. But the council is required by the law to prioritize advantages to disadvantaged communities, and I'll talk about how those are defined in a moment. The council, the Climate Action Council, and I haven't introduced the council, I will do that. The folks making the decisions are required to identify measures to reduce emissions of co-pollutants, not just greenhouse gases, but what we call the criteria pollutants that we typically think of, have conventionally thought of as air pollutants. The law establishes a climate justice working group, and the purpose of the climate justice working group is to develop criteria by which to identify disadvantaged communities. These disadvantaged communities under the law are those communities that, by virtue of their socioeconomic criteria, their exposure to past environmental harms, or their likely exposure to the effects of climate change can be considered disadvantaged. And the reason the law puts a lot of emphasis in the identification of the criteria by which these disadvantaged communities will be identified is that the law also requires that the 35 to 40% of the benefits of all clean energy investments made by the state go to disadvantaged communities. Rulemakings that DEC might undertake to implement the Climate Action Council's recommendations have to ensure that there's no increase in co-pollutant emissions or disproportionate burdens on disadvantaged communities. DEC is also required to implement community air monitoring in disadvantaged communities. Under the law, at least 4 disadvantaged communities. That program has to be established by October of this year. And by June of 2024, DEC is required to prepare a strategy to reduce emissions. These are criterion pollutions, emissions in disadvantaged communities. We talk a lot in the agency about the requirements of the CLCPA Section 7, because what that does is, in addition to all the requirements that it puts on DEC, Section 7 creates essentially a state government-wide obligation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. All state agencies are to reduce their own emissions, their operational emissions, but in addition to that, all state agencies are required, when they take any action, whether that's issuing a permit, doing procurement, a license of any kind, are required to consider whether that action is inconsistent with or will interfere with attainment of the state greenhouse gas emission limits. And where they are inconsistent, where any inconsistent action is chosen, the agency must provide justification and identify alternatives or greenhouse gas emission mitigation measures. And Valdi mentioned he had testified at the dance camera hearing this afternoon, and I'll note that DEC's initial denial of the dance camera and the Astoria generation plant permits was the first instance in which the department has denied a permit based on this requirement, that of inconsistency with the state greenhouse gas emission limits. And we're also required, all state agencies are required to, when considering any action, those actions shall not disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities and should prioritize greenhouse gas and co-pollutant reductions in disadvantaged communities. DEC has developed a policy, actually updated a policy that's been around since 2009 that I helped write, and we helped write the update that was released for public comment at the end of last year. Public comment, I believe, closed on Commissioner's Policy 49, closed on February 7th, I believe, and we are currently reviewing the public comments on CP 49, but that will be the policy that will guide DEC in its implementation of CLCPA Section 7, and we believe will be a model for other agencies to follow as well. CLCPA, speaking of adaptation, also amended the Community Risk and Resiliency Act, which is a law that was enacted in 2014, which at the time required that applicants for major permits in a small number of permit programs that DEC administers consider sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding. Not very many projects actually affected by that, but the CLCPA, in addition to establishing greenhouse gas emission limits and so forth, amended CARA, and it did so by requiring that in all DEC permit programs, all those covered by the Uniform Procedures Act, and that's essentially all of our permits, for any applicant for a major permit in any of those programs has to could be required to show consideration not just of sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding, but essentially any climate change effects. And it also, for the first time, gave DEC explicit authority to require mitigation of significant climate risk. The original CARA did not do that. It didn't give DEC authority to require someone who was applying for a permit to mitigate the risk that project might cause under future conditions to natural resources, nearby community, or so on and so forth. DEC is now authorized to require that kind of mitigation, and we have begun to do that. We have, in terms of current implementation, ongoing review of our permit programs. We've established an internal work group that is reviewing all of our permit programs to identify where consideration of climate and weather are relevant, and to determine what regulatory and permitting amendments are necessary to comply with this new requirement. So, getting back to the CLCPA specifically, under the CLCPA, the DEC has the primary regulatory role in limiting greenhouse gas emissions. Other agencies are authorized in consultation with DEC to undertake rulemakings that would contribute to reducing greenhouse gases, but DEC is the primary regulator. DEC's regulations under the law are to be guided by a scoping plan that's to be developed by a Climate Action Council. The Climate Action Council, it comprises 22 appointees, and it is co-chaired by the president of NYSERDA. Valdi mentioned he had tried to contact Doreen Harris, talk to her staff. She is one of the co-chairs, along with DEC's Commissioner Basil Sagos. The Climate Action Council appointed 7 advisory panels to make recommendations for greenhouse gas reductions in major emission sectors, including the Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel, to which I was appointed. Although the CLCPA does not specifically require that the scoping plan that is to guide DEC's emission reduction regulations include recommendations for adaptation and resilience. The council co-chairs did ask the Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel to develop adaptation recommendations, and I was tasked with leading the work group that did that. And we do have in the scoping plan a chapter, I think it's the final chapter, of adaptation recommendations as well. I will note that those adaptation recommendations are not binding on anybody. They're not, even though they are specific as in most cases as to which agency, or in some cases the state legislature should take, what action those entities should take. Those recommendations are not binding. All the recommendations that have been approved by the CAC, the Climate Action Council, are now embodied in the draft scoping plan, which the council released for public comment on December 30th. Technically, the plan was made public on December 30th of 2021, and the public comment period opened on January 1st. The law requires that we hold at least 120-day public comment period. So this public comment period will run on the scoping plan will run through the end of April. We are required to hold at least 6 public hearings. Those will likely commence in mid-March and run through, be scheduled through mid-April. The schedule is not yet final, but they are working on it, and we do expect that it will be released in the not too distant future. Just to go back and discuss the timeline a little bit and to point out some of the things that have been done. There have been some, I would say, unfortunate and uninformed comments from some of the advocacy community that nothing has been done with the CLCPA, and I can tell you that that is far from the truth. Looking at what has been done in the past, the PSC has already established its Make Ready order, which is to facilitate construction and siting of utility scale renewables. There's my office has adopted regulations to begin regulating hydrofluorocarbon usage in certain end uses. The PSC, and I'll talk about why that's important if we have time. The PSC has adopted the standard, the clean energy standard, to ensure 70% renewables by 2030. What else have we done? My office has issued guidance on the use of a social cost of carbon. We actually did that by the end of 2020, and my office also promulgated the regulation that set those emission limits, those 2030 and those 2050 greenhouse gas emission limits. We now have a number to attach to those by regulation. The RGGI operating plan, which defines how the proceeds from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative will be issued, will be spent, how those proceeds will be spent, has been issued. Further, by the end of this past year, most recent year, 2021, we have issued, DEC has issued its Section 7 guidance. That's internal guidance, but important to how we will implement the CLCPA. And we have issued, my office has issued the first statutorily required annual greenhouse gas inventory. In the past, NYSERDA has taken upon itself to issue a greenhouse gas inventory. That was not required by law. The CLCPA actually switched responsibility to produce that annual report of New York State's greenhouse gas emissions to DEC, and specifically to the Office of Climate Change, and our office did release that. What we anticipate, and as I have already said, we released, pursuant to the requirements of the law, the draft scoping plan before the January 1st of 2022. Through early 2022, there will be this public comment period, including the public hearings, and staff and the Climate Action Council will begin to prepare the final draft plan, which is due at the end of 2022, by January 1st of 2023. Once that once a scoping plan is finalized, the state energy plan to be produced, developed after the scoping plan, must reflect the findings or the recommendations of the final scoping plan. And DEC has one more year by January 1st of 2024 to promulgate the regulations that will implement the recommendations of the scoping plan to achieve the required emission reduction. So you know, that's really not very much time when we think about how much work goes.
We just lost your volume, Mark.
How's that?
You're back. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So
Can I
looking,
ask-
sure, go ahead.
Can I ask a quick question? So they don't have to have the final plan available until January of 2024?
23. We're working on, we have 1 year after the draft plan to finalize the plan.
Okay. All right.
And then a year after that for the regulations.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Thank
All
you.
right.
Sorry.
Yep. And understand that, you know, with most of our regulatory packages, of anything that has the least complexity, it often takes 2 to 3 years to develop them. So, you know, we are actually beginning to think already about the kind of regulations we will likely need. We can't wait until the draft plan is finalized before we start the preparing the rulemakings. So, but thinking about what our current emissions are, this bar graph simply illustrates the enormity of the challenge we face. We're going to have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from about 375 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is what they were in 2019, to about 61 million metric tons over the next 30 years. If you look to the left, that the circular graph, the inner ring indicates the relative proportions represented by our major emissions sector. In the outer ring, the contribution of sources within each of those sectors, just to give you an idea of where our emissions come from here in New York. We are a little bit different than much of the rest of the world. Many people tend to think of power plants as the major cause of climate change, but here in New York, those power plants only emit about 13% of our greenhouse gases. In fact, New York State has the cleanest electrical grid in the nation as it is. In New York State, it is our transportation sector at 28% and our buildings at 32% or so that represent the largest sources of emissions. Our waste management at 12% is responsible for almost as much emissions as our power generation sector, and agriculture in New York is relatively small. You hear about it being so large in many states, but because of the agriculture we have and because just the proportionality, agriculture is important at about 6%, but still a relatively small portion of our New York State emissions. The draft scoping plan, and it's going to get a little bit technical here, and I will try to take it slow. The draft scoping plan includes 4 greenhouse gas mitigation scenarios. One scenario is based on what we were calling foundational strategies that have to be included if we are to come close to achieving the required emission reductions. And then there are 3 action scenarios that provide for some options and policy discussion. And I'll say it this way. When we first started looking at all of the strategies that might be used, there was discussion, well, how do we prioritize these different strategies? And presumably it would be on cost and ease of implementation, so forth. How do we choose which of these strategies we implement? But as NYSERDA and its consultants started to model the emission reductions that we were likely to see under any of these strategies, it soon became apparent that discussion of priorities was really moot, because it meant that we were going to have to do virtually what we were seeing was we're going to have to do all of them to come close, or almost all of them. So we don't talk much about prioritizing, because the foundational strategies are going to have to be included regardless of what minor variations we may choose. The 3 scenarios that we do have in the scoping plan differ somewhat on the use of the low carbon fuels derived from biomass and green hydrogen versus an accelerated transition away from all combustion. So there are certainly some stakeholders who are advocating for the heavy reliance on biomass and green hydrogen, continued combustion of those types of materials, versus other stakeholders who, for various reasons largely related to public health, the fact that even combustion of biomass and green hydrogen and biomass in particular can produce co-pollutants, are concerned about that and would like to see us make a faster transition away from all combustion. And then there are the 4th scenario is termed the beyond 85% reduction, where many of the policies that are in the foundational policies are accelerated. And of course, that comes at higher cost. None of these scenarios represents a specific plan or a recommendation, but they are intended to show the range of options that are available to decision makers and on which the council was inviting stakeholder comment now. This figure looks really busy. Many of these slides are available at the Climate Act's website. That's climate.ny.gov, and this one in particular is available. So I'm not going to review it in detail here. You can certainly find it at climate.ny.gov and peruse it at your leisure, but I'll just point out the degree of similarity. So this shows all 4 scenarios, and you can see they're very similar. Just largely, again, reflects the fact that achieving our required reductions will require that we implement virtually every greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategy we can think of, with just a very little room for choices among policies. The draft scoping plan scenarios advance several key strategies that are fundamental to achieving the emissions limits, and I'll go through those a little bit. These strategies include deep improvements in energy efficiency across all sectors, but particularly in our buildings. And we use in New York natural gas in particular, but also propane and oil to not only heat our space, but to heat our water. And we must ensure that heating of water and space is electrified primarily through the use of high energy heat pumps, and that gas for cooking is eliminated, moving to induction cook services, which I use personally and would strongly endorse. Of course, we anticipate that this kind of transition to no fossil fuel use will take place first in new buildings, but also eventually in existing buildings as equipment reaches the end of its useful life and has to be replaced. It's like recommendations would include requiring that replacements be not based on not using fossil fuels. Climate justice and good land conservation demand that we enhance our mass transit. We can't reduce our transportation-based greenhouse gas emissions just by putting everyone in an electric vehicle. We do need better mass transit. We need to institute true smart growth and reduce our vehicle miles traveled. We will have to electrify our transportation, starting particularly with light-duty vehicles, and of course, our newly electrified economy must be powered by zero emissions electricity. And as you're probably aware, the governor has gotten ahead of the scoping plan in that she has signed a law that will phase out the use of gas and diesel light-duty vehicles to essentially eliminate them by 2035, which was a recommendation of the Climate Action Council. You may be aware of the problem with high global warming potential refrigerants. The substances like Freon that we put in our refrigerators and chillers, whether they're in our homes or our automobiles, these substances have very high capacity to trap heat. In many cases, molecule by molecule, they are thousands or even tens of thousands times more efficient at trapping heat than is carbon dioxide. It's illegal to purposefully emit these refrigerants in most cases, but things leak. Anyone who has had their car AC recharged, all of that Freon or whatever the coolant was has gone into the atmosphere. And that happens with virtually all equipment. And so we do need to make a transition to low global warming potential refrigerants, which we've already started to do in New York by, as I mentioned, beginning to regulate some end uses of some refrigerants. We also are going to have to reduce our fugitive methane emissions across the waste, agriculture, and energy sectors. And particularly, we are concerned about methane leakage from the oil and gas sector, and we've begun to regulate that. And at the same time, we are going to maximize carbon sequestration in our lands and forests. And we will also require a diverse portfolio of solutions to electrify our industry, and to improve its energy efficiency. And one of the difficult sectors to electrify is going to be those industrial processes that require high temperatures. And so low carbon fuels such as bioenergy, fuels derived from biomass, or green hydrogen will likely be necessary in some of these hard to electrify applications, such as aviation, heavy duty vehicles, or, as I just said, high temperature industrial processes. With regard to electricity demand, as we replace fossil fueled heating systems with heat pumps, New York State will transition from a summer peaking system. What that means is right now our peak electricity use in New York comes about during the summer during the summer when we use it for air conditioning. We will transition to a winter peaking system, probably by about, I believe it's 2030 or 2035 is the projection. And that will be because we will be using electric heat pumps, not resistance heating, but heat pumps to heat our homes and our water. And that will convert us to becoming a winter peaking system. And when that occurs, we will probably need to use bioenergy or green hydrogen in addition to battery storage to ensure grid reliability, as our electrical consumption is projected to double by 2030 or 2035. And I want to make the point that when we talk in the very beginning, maybe the second or third slide, when I showed how much more wind power is being required, how much more solar we have to install, that's not intended to meet current electrical demand. That's in anticipation of this doubled electrical consumption that we will see as we electrify our entire economy. Methane, as you almost certainly know, is a very powerful greenhouse gas. And I think I've already mentioned, we must reduce those emissions not only from our oil and gas infrastructure, but from our waste management and agricultural activities. The Climate Act allows us to count sequestration of the equivalent of up to 15% of our 1990 emissions toward achievement of our net zero goal. And let me say that a little bit differently, perhaps more clearly. Not only the regulatory portion for which DEC is responsible is that we reduce our emissions to no more than 15% of our 1990 emissions by 2050. But the Climate Action Council is also supposed to come up with a plan to achieve net zero. And the assumption is that we would achieve the difference by sequestering an additional 15%, the equivalent of 15% of our 1990 emissions in our forest and agriculture and forest soils. The difficulty is that this is going to be difficult to do. We already have a lot of forest, and there may not be much room to grow enough forest to sequester enough carbon to achieve that 15% goal, if you will. So that may require us, in achieving net zero, to reduce emissions by more than 85% of their 1990 levels, or rely on technologies such as carbon capture and sequestration or direct air capture of carbon dioxide. Of course, there will be costs, but also benefits. And NYSERDA has compared the anticipated costs of the 3 action scenarios with the benefits and the job creation opportunities that these scenarios are anticipated to create. NYSERDA estimates that the investments of a relatively small proportion of the state's gross state product, on the order of less than 1% of our gross state product in 2030, would yield net benefits of $90 to $120 billion to the New York State economy between now and 2050. Now, where do these benefits come from? They are based on a combination of the reduction of cost to global society. Essentially, they incorporate the social cost of carbon at about $121 a ton, but there will also be substantial health benefits directly to New Yorkers. And that is because as we cease reduce combustion of fossil fuels to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we also will be eliminating our largest source of other pollutants. And these pollutants, as you know, cause and exacerbate a large variety of cardiorespiratory illnesses, and particularly among the elderly, children, the urban poor, and outside workers. So there will be substantial health benefits, and those can be monetized to show that we will, in the end, benefit from this transition. it won't be cost free, but there will be benefits to offset and exceed those costs when monetized. So I'm just showing this slide as a review of the summary of the strategies that are in the draft plan. There are a few things that are not in the plan that are still open to discussion, and on which the council has more work to do. In addition to considering the public comment that we expect the council to receive, the council will be include discussion of several critical topics, including potential use or abandonment of our current gas infrastructure. This is one of the few topics where there was, if you've watched any of the Climate Action Council meetings, and the recordings are all available online. If you've seen everything you want to see on Netflix and would like to see how this council has been working, those recordings are available. And one of the most definite splits among the members of the council has been on this question of whether we should continue to maintain our current gas infrastructure and the investment it represents, and use it for biogas or green hydrogen, or most likely mixes thereof, or whether we need to maintain our ability to pipe natural gas to folks for reliability, or whether we should abandon that infrastructure altogether because it tends to leak and keeps us and it just represents a potentially stranded investment. There was also huge questions about financing implementation of the plan, including potential carbon pricing. The advisory panels were not directed to come up with suggest ways to finance their recommendations. We were directed to come up with, to identify those strategies that were necessary to achieve the required emission reductions, and it will be up to the council, informed by public comment, to make recommendations as to how all this is going to be paid for and who is going to be footing the bill. So just in terms of next steps, the public comment period, as I already mentioned, will be open through the end of April. You can see all this information at climate.ny.gov, and that includes recordings of all past meetings, slide presentations, slides representing the recommendations, but most of all, it includes the draft scoping plan itself. And you can download that, and there are on the website instructions on how to comment. You can submit written comments. There is a form that online form that you can submit, which is the preferred method to help us, those of us who are going to be sifting through these comments and trying to synthesize them and put them to good use. In addition to the 6 required in-person and virtual hearings that will be the formal hearings that will be held in March and April, it's anticipated that there will be a number of public events intended to inform discussion. These would likely be roundtables with experts discussing topics like what to do with that gas infrastructure, or how do we pay for this. And we are also continuing to look for opportunities to make public presentations just like this one. So if you belong to other groups or have contacts with others who should hear this presentation, to the extent that we have speakers available, let us know, and we will try to schedule a presentation like this as well. I should also mention that I mentioned early on that the Climate Justice Working Group was required by the law, established by the law, for the purpose of developing or identifying the criteria by which disadvantaged communities would be identified. That work is ongoing. The Climate Justice Working Group anticipates releasing its draft criteria and the maps that show the communities that are being identified as disadvantaged communities in the next couple of weeks. So that will be still another deliverable that would be out for public comment at the same time that the draft scoping plan is out for public comment. So if you think your calendar is busy now, just wait. There's even more for you to review and comment on. The other thing that the Climate Justice Working Group was required to do and did was release its report on the barriers that disadvantaged communities face with regard to access to community and community ownership of resources like clean energy resources, energy efficiency resources, and adaptation assets. So I think I've been talking for about 45 minutes. I can continue to talk, and I can't see you right now because I've got you covered with my screens here. I can continue to talk, or would you like me to stop and take questions?
I'd prefer questions.
Jim, do you want to go first?
So you were on the land use committee,
Yes.
and when it comes to, I reviewed the transportation section, and there was a great deal of talk about MOD, mobility optimized development. And when you're making rules for development, what's going to happen and where it's going to happen in your community, that's usually in the purview of the local municipality. So how does moving forward on mobility optimized development interface with the ideas that local municipalities may have that are different than the ones that would be helpful to the greenhouse gas goals?
Right. Yeah, and that's an excellent question because New York is what we call a home rule state, and the bane to New York State planners, it makes it difficult to implement statewide policy when it is in fact municipalities who hold the cards, but that's the system we have, for better or worse. I think the reality is that the staff who made those recommendations, well, not only the staff, and it was actually, there were very few staff on those advisory panels, and maybe that's the point I should have made. Most of those advisory panels were comprised folks from academia, local governments, stakeholders, NGOs, businesses, and so forth. There were very few staff on any of the advisory panels. But having said that, I think that the members of the advisory panel that made those kinds of recommendations, if you look at them in detail, you'll see that mostly they recommend that the state incentivize or fund, use its soft power, if you will, to try to entice municipalities to do things like implement MOD or smart growth, but recognizing that the state actually has very little direct land use authority.
Yeah, there were a lot of shoulds in the transportation section.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yep.
If I could jump on the land use for hopefully a quick question. I expected to see more in there on the capacity for the various types of energy we're going to need. And I didn't. So where does that come with the scoping plan or the final plan? I mean, we need to know where the various solar panels and wind turbines and hydro are going to be situated in the state.
Sure. That kind of information is included in the integration analysis, and I think I neglected to use that term. So the those scenarios that I talked about are there is an concurrent with the development of the draft scoping plan. As the advisory panels developed their recommendations and provided them to the council, NYSERDA and its consultants, all of whom are much smarter people than I am, modeling these kinds of systems. Modeled in our ability to achieve the likely emission reductions we are likely to achieve with different strategies, and part of the input of that model or those models was the capacity, and they would be able to tell you how many megawatts of solar we needed, and approximately how many sightings that would require, or how many wind turbines that would require. So that's that. And those capacity estimates are inherent to the modeling, and if you dug into the details of the modeling, you could probably find them. I haven't done that, but if you want to follow up with me, I can direct you to someone who could give you that kind of information. But certainly, I think it's worth saying that one of the primary principles has been that we need to ensure grid reliability. We've seen the problems that have taken place, for instance, in Germany, when it did not make its transition in a particularly orderly way from nuclear to wind and solar. And so there is a very strong commitment among the PSC, the Department of Service, NYSERDA, and the NISO in particular, to ensure reliability of the grid.
And Mark, as far as the integration analysis, that's not in the scoping plan, then that's supporting documentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I participated in another presentation given by another person. I don't know if that person appreciates me giving the name, so I won't. But it was hosted by a League of Women Voters, or a League of Conservation Voters in the Saratoga area about a month ago. And I asked a similar question, basically, where's the specifics of how much wind we need, how much solar we need, how much storage we need, how much extra transmission capacity in terms of power lines in existing rights of way, and maybe even new rights of way do we need to develop, and where specifically, at least by region, maybe to the Finger Lakes region, the Buffalo area in general. Maybe you can't say by county, but by region. And the response I got back was, well, they modeled this in an integration analysis, and that's in the appendices. So at that point, I kind of shut my mouth, because I hadn't looked at the appendices in any detail whatsoever, and I went and looked at the appendix specifically for the electricity sector, and that detail is not in that section.
No, I wouldn't have told you that. I believe there is detail on the modeling as part of the supporting documentation. Whether that gets down to, I'm not sure that includes the transmission. I believe it does include necessary generation capacity.
Okay, well, whatever detail that you can provide, I'm going to ask you a couple of things here. Number one, can you please make your slides available when you have time to do it? We would appreciate that, and we would share that along with the recording of this presentation via our website. It'll end up on YouTube, and the access to the slides will be from our Susquehanna Group website. Number two, please, by email to me, and I can share with my executive committee and anybody else that's in attendance here that wants access to those, I will make that available too. Where's this documentation that has more specifics? We that are spending time reviewing this to try to come up with intelligent comments for this draft scoping plan, which is really critical, especially for the power generation, because so much of the rest of this economy-wide transition relies on the power generation, which is a massive task if that was the only thing we had to do. And we're looking for where's the plan? Right now, all we're seeing is recommendations and just generalities of, yeah, we need about this much wind and about that much solar, and oh, by the way, we need to double our generation capacity, and that's not specific enough. And we need timelines too, not just a certain goal by 2030 and another certain goal by 2040. It needs to be year by year. This is where we want to be, and if we're not there, somebody needs to have the authority to make corrective actions so that we get back on track. This is what I'm getting at.
I did show a graph that showed the projected trajectory of emission reductions. That's based on the integration analysis. The supporting documentation is available at climate.ny.gov.
Okay. All right. All right.
And the other thing I didn't mention is the CLCPA requires DEC to issue a report every 4 years on the status of the implementation. So there is a 4-year check on how we are doing toward achieving the required emission reductions.
Yeah, I hope internally they have a year by year tracking plan.
Well, there's an annual emission reduction, or there's an annual report on the inventory. So there's an annual inventory and a greenhouse gas emission report, and then there's a more comprehensive report due every 4 years.
Okay. All right. Well, that'll be helpful, and I hope that I can find it. If you can provide a hint as to where we can find this type of detail I was looking for, if you can email that to me, I would really appreciate it, because if we have to spend a lot of time wading through lots of documentation and it's not obvious as to where it is, it would save us a lot of time, because we're trying to do this to help you as well as the others that are tasked with this monumental project, which is, I mean, like you said, Germany had difficulty, and we don't want to end up repeating those mistakes. So intelligent comments are really going to be helpful, and I know that there are industry insiders that are part of this Climate Action Council, and that worries me. One direct question I'm going to ask before I give up the floor here to other people is, there's another battle that we're fighting in the background, and that is an out-of-state company that has come in that is asking, this is the agricultural sector now, and you kind of briefly mentioned this, and again, the devil is in the details, that some people want to use the existing pipeline system to now use dairy concentrated animal feeding operations to produce methane, get credits for this from California, and inject it into a interstate pipeline system for delivering and distributing natural gas, and then using that to claim that they are saving greenhouse gas emissions. And I have spent a lot of time looking at this, as well as many other people have spent a lot of time looking at this. And the more you dive into the details, the worse this idea looks. So this type of stuff, if somebody is just reviewing it, like the administrative law judge from the Department of Public Service, as well as the PSC commissioners that were in this hearing, this was about, 2 or 3 weeks ago, they don't have the technical background to understand what they're reviewing. And they basically were very deferential to the applicants in determining the procedure to be followed legally coming up. So this worries me. And the other thing that even the dance camera hearing here, using hydrogen to burn produces nitrous oxides, which are 300 times as bad per molecule as CO2 in terms of greenhouse gas warming potential. So there's a lot of details. And there's another thing too that you didn't mention, but I'm sure somebody knows. Sulfur hexafluoride is a gas that is used as an insulator in high voltage switching equipment, and that's thousands of times as bad as CO2. And that leaks from these switching equipment at substations too. So there's many, many details that really need to be regulated and need to be followed and ruled properly. So anyway, thanks for listening.
Any other questions?
Yes, if I could, please. I'm just wondering about three of the sort of mitigation measures you mentioned. First one is biomass energy. Where is that going to come from in New York State? It often means replacement of agriculture or forests. Secondly, hydrogen means splitting water, and that's very energetic. And I think it's unproven that as yet how we're going to actually make that a viable strategy. And the third one is, what was it? That's almost enough. Oh, yes, sequestering carbon dioxide by means other than green means. I don't know what you might want to say now, but you could just pick one of those if you like. But
Well, I just want to emphasize, I'm not advocating that, nor is the council has not included those in its final plan. Those are things that have been suggested, and they have been, all three of those strategies have been included, in the modeling, but there's no final determination that they will be part of the mix of strategies. In case of the green hydrogen or hydrogen, it is very possible that, or you're right, making hydrogen from water can be very energy intensive, would take electricity. So for it to be truly green, it needs to be done by using renewable sources. Is that the best way to use our renewable sources? On the other, but the counter argument is we may need that for hard to electrify activities. There has been quite an argument getting down to argument between among technical people, exactly how much hydrogen we can put in our pipeline. Apparently there are differences of opinion of how much hydrogen, even if it's completely green, that a pipeline that's designed for natural gas can actually transmit. And that's not something I have any expertise in, and there were differing technical opinions presented to the council. So I don't have a good answer for you, and by the same token, where the biomass would come from, if that were recommended, it would come probably from wood waste. One of the things that foresters tell me is that, we do have a lot of low-grade forest, a lot of low-grade timber in New York State. Back in the 30s, the Civilian Conservation Corps planted a lot of red pine and Scott pine and that kind of plantation, which is now deteriorating, trying to find markets for that kind of wood product, including potentially using it for biomass, whether it's combusted or gasified, may be a way to allow forest owners the financial ability to maintain their better quality forests and to manage them in a way that is better suited for carbon sequestration.
thank you.
And whether commercial or industrial carbon capture and sequestration can ever be scalable, I'm not an engineer, and you could get 40 engineers and they would split 20-20 and fight to the death about it. It's still an argument of whether it can be scalable or not.
I think you're a lovely man to take all our questions. And I think what this shows me is that there's a flaw in the planning process. It's usually the process and not the people. When we ask you a question, you give us a very, very reasonable answer. And for those of us with any background in performance indicators and using them to manage something, I'm like a cave person, but I did it in healthcare, is the doorknob clean? That was the level. But when you measured it, the doorknob was clean and the doorknob wasn't clean, you had a system for cleaning the doorknob. And of course, someone like Valdi, he's way up there. He's way technical, but it's the same process. And for those of us who have that background, we get very, very nervous. We feel we have been left out of the curing, left out of the caretaking. And so I'm just wondering, if there is some way that citizens who wanted in the middle of something, maybe 6 years from now, to have the same conversation with you about, say, green hydrogen. Where is it at now? I have a feeling that, there are these steering wheels, and we kind of look at them at the beginning when we're doing the scoping plan, and then we'll never see it again. We'll never see whether the doorknob is being checked. We'll never see what you want to use to clean the doorknob. And, for the public, for people like us, we are so invested. I'm wondering if you couldn't have some way for us to check in if there is a decision to be made, at a management level. If something isn't working the way you planned, or you discover some wonderful thing and you don't know this or that, we would feel much better. And I don't want you to go away saying that we attacked you, but I do want to register for those of us with these backgrounds, how frustrating this is for us. We're not exactly sure that whatever was measured like forever, and that will be the answer. And somehow magically, 4 years from now or 5 years from now, magically, whatever that was predicted, that's what we're going to do. And people like us will be left out.
I have to admit, I'm a little baffled as to exactly what you want me to do.
I want you to be accessible to us when there are decisions to be made, when there are new decisions to be made, and to especially with for me, especially when you're making a decision about something that seems like you don't even know whether it's a valid approach or not. And now 3 or 4 years down the line, you have to make a decision about biomass or something else like that, or green hydrogen, and let us have some control about thinking this through. I mean, I have noticed even in laws that have to do with, say, state government, they start a law with cement. I love the bill about cement. I go look, a month later, and the approach to the cement is totally different than what it was when they did the first draft. I feel I have no control. And, we care about this the same way you do. We don't have your responsibility. We don't have your experience, but we care so much. We certainly don't want to have any kind of false solution, being adopted without public scrutiny.
Well,
Okay, go ahead, Mark. I was going to let you take it.
As I said, there is a requirement that there be every 4 year an implementation report. That's a formal check-in that has to be done. I'll be retired before that first one is due, but someone will have to do it.
Sure, there were another guy, right?
And then, to put almost any of these things into action, DEC or some other agency has to promulgate a regulation. And every regulation has a public input process.
Okay.
Those vary. The degree to which those incorporate public, do we form task forces or do we just have a public comment period? That varies. And I can't commit to what other agencies might do. But I think most this plan is a blueprint, but the actual implementation is going to be the regulatory programs and the funding programs that are put in place.
And the public will have input.
Sure.
Okay.
I mean,
Well,
that's a
very
requirement
reassuring. Very reassuring. Thank you.
Well, we're getting close to 9. We don't want to keep Mark real late, but
Past my bedtime.
Yeah.
I haven't been paying much attention to the questions. I do see the one about hydro. It's anticipated that the current hydro capacity will stay about the same. There's not a lot of capacity to add more, I think is why you don't see it discussed in the plan as more proactive policies.
Good.
Not sure.
Thanks for that.
And I see another one from Mr. Perry about the land-based wind and difficulty in siting. Certainly true. And that may be one of the difficulty in siting wind farms and solar farms, utility scale solar, might be one of the most difficult challenges we're going to face in terms of meeting the requirements of the CLCPA.
Yeah,
it's a fact.
And I'm going to give you a little might make you feel better. Even amongst the environmental activist community, there's arguments even about something like solar, especially when it comes to siting it on farms. And I've participated in meetings when this has come up, and it's just painful to listen to, because certain people have this idea that we now have to preserve farmland even if it's not being used for producing crops, and they want to produce a law to ban putting large-scale solar farms on farmland. That it's just like, why are we doing this? It's so anyway. Please don't take my comments about, that you happen to be the person here that's representing this draft scoping plan, and it's unfair. I don't want you to think that we don't appreciate what you're doing, because I know that you care about this, and I know that you are doing this because you care for your own children and potential grandchildren if you haven't had any yet. So I do appreciate the work you're doing. We're just asking these questions because we have actually dove into this really long document, and we've started to figure out what's in there and what's not in there. And we're just nervous, as Rachel mentioned. And we've got a lot of questions and a lot of concerns. So I'm going to step aside. Does anybody else have any other questions?
The only other, thank you for that. And believe me, I don't take these personally. I've been doing controversial subjects for now almost for 34 years. And they've turned the lights out on me. Just noticed that suddenly got dark. But the other thing I forgot to mention, I did mention the state energy plan. And again, because the scoping plan is a blueprint, but it's actually the state energy plan that then starts to get down into more detail, and that has to be done, I think, every 3 years. Maybe it's 4.
Okay. Thank you.
Mark, I wanted to say that we've learned a lot from you in this abbreviated period of time, and I'm glad you're on the case.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Once my final question, I have others, but we're running out of time. In all the scoping, has there been any discussion or consideration of something as simple as a carbon tax?
That is one of the things that the council is supposed to take up this year. So there's no recommendation with regard to any carbon pricing, whether it's a tax or market-based policies, in the current draft scoping plan. But the plan is to develop that and to take public input on that question, and include recommendations in the final plan. But of course, the only body that can levy a tax in New York State is the state legislature. So the council may well recommend that there be a carbon tax, but it would be up to the legislature to actually enact that.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah, so basically, unless somebody has another question, if you do, please use the raise hand function or wave your arms wildly, so that maybe we get to notice you. I really encourage everybody that attended tonight to at least pick one section of that they understand and or care about, that is listed section by section. There's agriculture, there's land use, there's agriculture and forestry, there's power generation. There's all these major sections of this draft scoping plan, and this is the initial planning document that sets the direction for how New York State is going to do its share to reduce its greenhouse gas footprint in accordance with the law that was passed, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, back in July of 2019. So it's important. The state is actually asking you, citizens, residents of New York, to comment. They're providing ample opportunity. They're going to have these meetings, which probably will be conducted by Zoom. Maybe some of them might be in person, maybe by hybrid, depending on how the COVID-19 crisis continues to unfold. So I encourage everybody to stay engaged, to do some reading, do some study, get involved with our group, other activist groups. There's plenty of them across New York State, and stay on top of this subject. There's many things that are still going to be happening, and we've got, as Mark mentioned, until the end of April to give written comment, and there's going to be some opportunity to give verbal comment too. So please take advantage of those opportunities and do a little homework so that you have some intelligent comments to make, because this is a major thing. And as Mark said, if we are the 10th largest economy on the planet, what we do here makes a big deal for the entire world, and it makes a big deal for the United States, because it can set an example of how California, that also is trying to compete with us neck and neck, trying to do the right thing, and other states that are reluctant, afraid to join in. We can show them how it can be done. So we want to make a positive difference, and the earlier we start with substantial changes, even beyond the draft scoping plan, there's projects that are being reviewed at many different levels: wind farm, solar farm projects, storage, energy storage right here in the town of Union. We're trying to get a company named GlidePath to give us a talk. They are behind that energy storage project. That's another thing that needs to be talked about more, because that is really needed, for making the grid grow and be stable while we transition away from fossil fuels. So all of these things are important, and you've got your opportunity to comment. So please take advantage of that. And really, a heartfelt thank you to Mark Lowery. You did a fantastic job, much better than the other person's talk that I listened to about a month ago. You gave much more details, and you made it understandable, and you kept us awake, which it's dense subject matter. It's hard to do. And even though it's dark in your room now,
Yeah, I'm trying to.
lighted a light through the darkness of this tunnel we have to get through.
Thank you. A number of you put questions in the chat that I did not address, and I haven't captured that chat, but I just put my email address in there. Feel free to contact me, and I'll see what I can do to get answers for you.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
I can barely see my own keyboard now. I've got this black keyboard in this obviously dark room.
Yeah.
Okay. Are we about done?
You're about done.
Yes.
Yeah, we should let Mark get on with his evening.
Yeah, and thank you again, Jerry. You really deserved that Linda Spickert Award, and we were happy to present it to you. And I'm sorry we couldn't do it in person, and I'm sorry you missed the recording of the initial presentation. But at least we got a quick recap recorded for you. So thanks again.
No
you.
regrets. Have a great night.
Good night.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Nice being with you.